Give us a minute to get everybody seated, and then we should be good. Yeah. Hello. Let's do it. My name is Nick. It's great to meet you. I work here at the Hinckley Institute. Okay, so actually, we're gonna have you in this seat if that's okay. Just gonna make sure we're all live. 2, great. We're good. So let's go ahead and clip it just on your jacket. And then this can either go in your jacket pocket or pants pocket, whatever's most comfortable for you. All right. Wonderful. And then I'll unmute you when we get started. And we'll get Jason. I'm going to go get you a water if that's okay.
That'd be great.
Hey, Dia, could you actually go grab 2 waters?
I'm not sure we're gonna have time for a Q&A, huh? 1:45 though, right?
I think so.
That's for sure the time. I think we're gonna go here till 1:45. That's okay, and then.
Right.
Okay. Okay, I'll be watching the clock. I'm not sure we're gonna have time for audience questions or not, but.
Whatever you think.
Okay. Okay. So, you're as accommodating as can be.
Go ahead and get started. Are we ready for Dia to kick us off?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
You should get that if you want to.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Hinckley Forum. My name is Dia Rao, and I will be the forum host for today's conversation. The Hinckley Institute of Politics is a nonpartisan institute at the University of Utah. The Hinckley provides an array of transformative experiences for students ranging from classes to internships and even forums. And the purpose of these forums is to foster public discourse and civil debate on the most current and pressing issues, bringing in local, national, and international leaders. Today's forum is a conversation with Ambassador John Bolton. We look forward to a great discussion, and we'd like to thank the World Trade Center Utah, the Deseret News, and the Kempsey Gardner Policy Institute for their partnership on this event. I'll now turn it over to Doug Wilkes, Executive Editor of the Deseret News.
Thank you so much. On behalf of the Deseret News, it's a pleasure to be here. Deseret News is committed to spreading truth and light around the world, and sometimes that means shining a light in dark places. Other times it's featuring guests with something interesting to say and things that can be world-changing. So with that, we're very pleased to have Ambassador John R. Bolton here today. He served as Assistant to the President and National Security Advisor from April 2018 to September 2019. Prior to his appointment, he served as a Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C., and as counsel at Kirkland & Ellis. He was appointed as United States Permanent Representative to the United Nations on August 1st, 2005, and served until his resignation in December 2006. He also served as Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security from May 2001 to May 2005. He has a host of other honors and certainly has been very visible and a leader in national and international affairs. He serves as Assistant Secretary for International Organization Affairs at the Department of State. He served as Assistant Attorney General with the Department of Justice, Assistant Administrator for Program and Policy Coordination at the U.S. Agency for International Development, General Counsel for the U.S. Agency for International Development, on and on and on, saving the world one department at a time. Today, he'll be joined in conversation by Jason Perry. Jason, as you recall, in 2016, hosted Mitt Romney's speech at this event, and this has been the scene of many wonderful and insightful things. So perhaps we'll make news today as Mitt Romney did in 2016. Jason's the Vice President for Government Relations and the Director of the Hinckley Institute of Politics at the University of Utah here. He brings more than 25 years of experience working in the public sector. He's worked extensively with policymakers at the local, state, and federal level. We work together on polling. I'm very happy for that partnership. And I'm very pleased to introduce them both. Let's give them a round of applause as we begin today's discussion.
Thank you, Doug. Yeah, we're so glad to have you here with us. You are indeed one of those guests, as he just said, that has something interesting to say. You've been involved in so many levels of government and really in positions that were critical to the national security, critical to our diplomacy efforts around the country. And I've talked to some students, and Ambassador, many students here today, and I've talked about some things that they're interested in. And since we are going to jump right in, if that's okay, can we go big really quick? Because we have some issues that they've talked about that I'd love to hear you talk about a little bit as well. And let's just start with this. It's a big one here. When you survey the world, what do you put in the category of the biggest risks to national security and a couple of things that you have done and you see going forward to resolve them or at least address them?
Well, the two biggest threats to the United States today and really to the global West as a whole, the strategic threats are China and Russia. Below that, at a more immediate level, are threats of proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, nuclear, chemical, and biological, and the continuing threat of international terrorism. So North Korea and Iran on the WMD threat, the return of foreign terrorist fighters to Afghanistan, which is proceeding at a rapid rate on the terrorism front, and a range of other issues. So we're operating really on different timelines, but because the immediate threats may seem more important, but the strategic threats are ultimately more important. And in that sense, I think the threat posed by China is really existential for the United States and its friends and allies in the 21st century. I think people are only waking up to it now, some faster than others. But although we focus with good reason on the ongoing war in Ukraine, the largest land war in Europe since World War II, what's happening beyond that is really ultimately more important. There's, I think, a shift in history going on here. Sometimes history moves quickly, sometimes history moves slowly, sometimes it moves very fast. Right now, we're moving very fast. And the post-Cold War era is over. Cold War itself ended on a pretty clear day. It was December the 26th, 1991, when the Soviet flag came down over the Kremlin and the Russian flag went up. It meant the disintegration of the Soviet Union. The post-Cold War era was a little bit more confused, but I think it's clearly over now, and the threats that the United States and its friends around the world face at the whole range of levels that I've just described really puts us in a very different environment. And there's a lot that can and should be done, a lot we're not doing now, a lot of mistakes we made in the past. There's a lot of work to do.
Mm-hmm. If I can break up a couple pieces of that response, because some students have talked to me about this relationship with China in particular, some of the expansion of China throughout many other parts of the world, how that impacts our relationships and what our strategy might be with regards to their expansion.
Yeah, well, the Chinese economic growth, many people believed, going back to the 1980s and the 1990s, would result in China becoming more democratic internally, and would result in China being a responsible stakeholder. That was the phrase, a responsible stakeholder engaged in a peaceful rise. That was the other phrase, internationally. And it turned out we were fundamentally wrong in thinking that economic growth in China, because of the rejection of some Marxist principles and the adoption of some capitalist principles, would have those impacts. China has become less democratic, not more democratic. Xi Jinping is now the most powerful Chinese leader since Mao Zedong, and the whole idea that rising economic levels in China would lead to the spread of democracy is proven to be fundamentally wrong. Second, the idea that China would behave in an orderly fashion internationally has proven also to be completely wrong. From the time that Deng Xiaoping made the shift away from Marxist principles, China has, among other things, stolen massive amounts of American, European, and Japanese intellectual property. One major reason for the economic growth China's seen is when you don't have to do research and development, when you can just steal the intellectual property, manufacture it, sell it at below market rates through subsidies into the territory of the people whose intellectual property you stole, you can make a lot of money and grow very quickly. Chinese have consciously benefited, protected their own domestic markets, excluded and discriminated against foreigners. They've taken the World Trade Organization, which should be a free trade organization, and applying their own mercantilist principles, fundamentally distorted it. And that's all of that on the economic side is just part of the larger threat they pose in political and military terms too. For example, you've all heard of Huawei and ZTE. These are not telecommunications companies. These are arms of the Chinese state that are directed to take control of fifth-generation telecommunications worldwide so that any communication they want can be scooped up and sent back to Beijing. China's engaged in an extraordinary expansion of its military capability. It has, in effect, taken over the South China Sea, built military bases on rocks and reefs and atolls that are a few inches above water on a good day. They have declared the South China Sea as a province of China. They've got a capital for the South China Sea. They contend that the South China Sea is now Chinese territorial waters. 50% of the world's ocean-borne trade goes through the South China Sea. That makes that a pretty significant fact. And on a range of other issues, particularly the focus we've seen in this country on Taiwan to try and delegitimize the government of Taiwan, to put it under threat, to insist that it's part of China, regardless of what the 25 million people in Taiwan think. All of that is underway now. So that this war, this struggle, has been waged by one side for a long time. And as I said a moment ago, we're just really beginning to fully appreciate the extent of the struggle and what's going to be necessary.
Can you talk about some of those things that will be necessary? Have policies from the United States changed in the face of these new realities, or the approach that wasn't what maybe we thought they would be?
Yeah, well, they have, and in part it's because we've woken up to what's going on. So, for example, in both the Trump and the Biden administration, significant sanctions have been placed on high-tech industries. Huawei and ZTE have been put under crushing sanctions. And we've begun to realize how vulnerable we are because so much of our industrial supply chain is dependent on China. So steps will have to be taken to make sure on national security matters in particular, we don't find ourselves dependent for critical technology or critical items from somebody that's going to be an adversary in a future struggle. I don't think this means that we need some broad industrial policy to decouple from China. That's not the issue. Individual firms, however, should recognize that political risk has returned, globalization. The era of globalization effectively is over in that respect, that you can invest anywhere on earth. You can invest in China. It's just like investing in Utah. What's the difference? It's just a little bit further away. Is not true. So all of this is new to us. We don't fully appreciate the extent of it, but people shouldn't be surprised at what China has already done and why we're worried about things they're doing now. I'll give you two examples. One, some years back, China hacked into the personnel records of the federal government in what's called the Office of Personnel Management in Washington, and pulled out of their computers copies of the personnel files of everybody they could who had ever worked for the federal government. Now that may sound pretty harmless. I mean, who cares about a lot of federal employee pay stubs? Well, it's more than that. It also includes, for example, every FBI investigation that's ever been done of a federal employee. I've had 1 million FBI investigations done of me for security clearances. Now, I've led a pretty boring life, so the Chinese can read my FBI files, doesn't bother me at all. There are other people who have led more exciting lives. That information is now in the possession of China. It can be used for any number of purposes. Blackmail would be the easiest, but they've also now got aggregate records of hundreds of thousands of federal employees. So when you hear Congress debate whether to ban TikTok, this is not just because of some adult misunderstanding of what TikTok is. I would urge all of you, if you don't remember it from your childhood, go back and read The Pied Piper of Hamelin, where the piper piped the children out of the city when the parents didn't know what was going on. At least in theory, every time you enter a keystroke in the TikTok app, that can go back to Beijing and form your own personnel file in Beijing. the beginning of them understanding you very, very well. This is the sort of well thought out gathering of information that boggles the American mind. We don't think in those terms. They are, and they are acting on it right now.
A couple of students I've talked to had questions connected to this too. So it's the technology, it's the TikToks, but it's also AI. And it used to be, maybe you can talk about how you used to be able to kind of work in the governments or the people inside governments. It's changed dramatically now. When you have AI, you can push a button, a bot could create some information and send out. How is this technology changing not just our security in the world, but how you engage in diplomacy?
Well, I don't think we really know the full extent of it. I think AI covers a wide variety of activities, some of which are more worrying than others. But undoubtedly, it's going to have a huge impact when it's now going to be, for example, harder to know what's a real communication from a foreign state and what's not. How you verify when you're speaking with somebody or communicating with somebody, and therefore determining what information is accurate or not accurate. It's hard enough to do that now. And if you've got people that are trying to feed, in effect, disinformation into the system through AI or any other mechanism, it's going to make it very, very difficult, and therefore the risk of making a mistake increases.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious about the impact, because I'm always curious about, you have public sentiment, and we live in a time when there's some considerable polarization. People picking sides, picking a flag, and I'm curious about the misinformation or the attempt to distribute certain kinds of information, if that really has a direct impact on national security or our policies outside the United States.
Well, we know over the past 8 or 10 years that foreign governments have made significant efforts to affect American elections and elections in Britain and other countries. And we know that they've gone beyond that to try and influence public opinion, to shape public opinion through propaganda and various other mechanisms that look like objective news, but in fact are not. One of the things that I focused on in my time as National Security Advisor was to change the rules on that had been developed in the previous administration on offensive cyber warfare capabilities. We knew in the 2016 election that Russia and others had tried to sow dissension in the United States, try and alienate Americans from their institutions, sow mistrust and confusion with some success. Now, you can do several things in response to that. You can try and weed out the misinformation. You can try and educate people on what's accurate and what's not. Or instead of simply playing defense, you can play offense. And you can take steps against the troll farms and other operations that Russia has set up that are putting this misinformation out. In the Obama administration, they didn't like offensive cyber operations. They thought cyberspace was kind of like the Garden of Eden, didn't want to see it weaponized and so on. In fact, obviously, cyberspace is no different than any other domain of human interactivity. There are good people in it, there are bad people in it. And if you're only playing defense, you're going to lose. So after the 2016 election, we did develop new rules for offensive cyber operations, and I think pretty effectively neutralized the Russians in the 2018 election. But this goes well beyond just cyber operations like that. The Chinese government in particular has programs all over the country that are intended to affect broad swaths of American public opinion that obviously then have an impact on elections, but are trying to influence our policies in ways that are really unprecedented.
Mm-hmm. Public opinion certainly has an impact on the political landscape. Putting on your hats, a couple of your many you've had as National Security Advisor, Ambassador to the UN, what is the kind of the connection between public opinion and policy itself? When you're in these positions, were you measuring public opinion when you were deciding what the right thing was to do for the country?
Well, the United States probably has more more of a reflection of public opinion and foreign policy than any other country. Number one, authoritarian countries couldn't care less what their public opinion is. They tell the public what their opinion is. So the Chinese communists in Beijing aren't worried about what people think of their efforts at subverting American elections, and that's true up until the authoritarian society is challenged, as the government of Iran is being challenged today by the people there. In other democratic societies in Western Europe, public opinion doesn't play that much of a role in foreign policy because the bureaucracy in the foreign ministry isn't subjected to the kinds of pressures that we see in the United States. In parliamentary systems, where the executive and the majority in parliament are coterminous, as long as the executive has a majority, they're not that worried. But in the United States, because of our history, we've got a lot of people with very vocal views, and they express them in Congress, and you have to deal with them all the time. Even as National Security Advisor, where I never testified because I worked for the president and so normally shouldn't be on the Hill, I spent a lot of time speaking with House and Senate members of both parties to explain what we were doing. America is a land of immigrants. People come from all over the world, and our ethnic communities in this country have rich connections with their countries of ancestry, and you hear about it all the time. People in the State Department are appalled by this kind of conflict because they think that they should be forming policy in the abstract. But in fact, in America, the interplay of politics and policy and foreign affairs is very real, and you can like it or not, but it's part of our heritage. And I think it's a good thing because, in a sense, this helps keep America connected with parts of the world that we might not otherwise pay much attention to. And it can be a pain in the neck, but ultimately I think it's a real benefit.
Mm-hmm. I want to talk about one of your comments regarding Russia for just a moment. I reached out in terms of this to one of our mutual friends, Ambassador John Huntsman, because you've been doing some work with him on arms control issues with Russia. Wonder if you might take a moment to talk about those, because this is what Ambassador Huntsman said to me was, this is one of our most unaddressed threats to humanity is still nuclear war.
Right. Well, there are nuclear powers in the world that have had long experience with nuclear weapons, and there are nuclear powers that have had no experience with nuclear weapons. You can say this about the U.S. and Russia. We have been at this since World War II, and so far have avoided the use of nuclear weapons. We have a long history of discussions about arms control. Many reached many agreements on the subject, most of which the Russians have violated, but which at least give us a pattern of activity with them that allows for interchange and the exchange of information. There are plenty of other countries that are seeking or have nuclear weapons that are fundamentally dishonest about it. North Korea and Iran are two good examples. And you have others that just won't talk about it at all. For example, China, which is rapidly trying to increase its number of deliverable nuclear weapons from maybe a couple hundred now up to the rough limits of the arms control agreements Russia and the U.S. have, 15 to 1,600 deliverable warheads. What that means is China is outside the realm of arms control, outside the exchange of views on this, and basically building up to a level where it could be a considerable threat to the United States. And in a world where you have, we have developed all of our theories of deterrence in a bipolar nuclear world. When I was in college, some of the great theoreticians were Thomas Schelling, Albert Wohlstetter, Herman Kahn, were still debating how to structure nuclear deterrence. And they disagreed with each other, and they had big arguments. Ultimately, it worked. But all of that theorizing about deterrence in a bipolar world is inapplicable in a three-way nuclear world, particularly when we don't know whether the Russians and the Chinese will be acting together or not. It's one thing to have a certain number of nuclear weapons to deter the Russians when you know where they are and you know how many, more or less, weapons they have, and you know how many you need in response. How do you operate in a tripolar nuclear world where it's not just Russia you have to worry about, but China? And if you're faced with a crisis with Russia on the one hand, what happens if you've got a crisis with China simultaneously? So it was dangerous during the Cold War, and a tripolar or even more significant nuclear powers, it's just that much more dangerous.
Talk about the extension from Russia beyond nuclear weapons to Ukraine. Talk about our policy there with what's happening, maybe the end game that you see happening from Putin there in Ukraine.
Yeah. Well, what Russia did in February of last year was to commit an active, unprovoked aggression against Ukraine. There's simply no question about it. People say, oh, but poor Russia, you built NATO right up to their borders. We didn't build anything up. The people, once freed from Soviet domination, when the Berlin Wall collapsed in 1989, was countries of Eastern and Central Europe came knocking on NATO's door, saying, let us in, we want protection against the Russians. And we let them in, and we should have. Wasn't threatening Russia in any way. What's happening now is that the Russians are, in effect, trying to recreate the Russian Empire. I said that deliberately, not the Soviet Union, but the Russian Empire. And this was foreshadowed in many respects. Vladimir Putin said in 2005 that the breakup of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. I thought it was a pretty good way to end the 20th century. Obviously, there's some Russians who disagree with that. And what he's doing now is only a second step in what he tried to do in 2014 when he seized the Crimea and put the forces into the Donbass region of eastern Ukraine. And the West as a whole in 2014 did not react at all. We had minimal sanctions. We took very few steps to convince the Russians that they should have paid a much higher price. So I think he thought he would get away with it again, and it's fortunate that he's not. But make no mistake, this is not just about Ukraine. It's about Moldova, Belarus, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and the 5 Central Asian republics, as well potentially as Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. It's not only geostrategically significant in Europe, although obviously that's where the focus of the activity is. There's nobody watching what's happening in Ukraine today more carefully than the leaders in Beijing, because they want to see whether the West is able to stand up to an act of unprovoked aggression on the continent of Europe. And I'll be very blunt about this. If the West can't prevent aggression against a country on the continent of Europe, the Chinese government will conclude that we're not going to come to Taiwan's defense. And once they conclude that, whether they actually invade, whether they create a pretext of a crisis to throw a blockade around the island, whatever they may do, once China thinks we will not come to Taiwan's aid, it's very, very bad for Taiwan.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk about the West? This sends a message, what the West does. Where do you see the United States in this effort? Where are we on the world stage, in your opinion? Are we where we should be? Have we found a balance? Are people still looking to the United States to help lead this effort?
Yeah, I should really say the global West, and we just saw the global West meet at the G7 in Hiroshima with Japan hosting. I really don't think the U.S. has a better ally in the world today than Japan. So the West is a composite term. It doesn't mean a geographical location anymore. Australia is not in the West either, but it's a close ally. So that's if I slip, just insert global before I say West every time, so we don't make that mistake. But the U.S. has to be the leader. We are the only global power. We are the only power that has interest and friends and allies in all parts of the world, and we are the only ones who can lead. With all due respect to some of our friends who have higher aspirations, they can't do the job that's necessary. President Macron of France, for example, said a couple months ago NATO was brain dead. I guess nobody told Sweden and Finland that, having abandoned 75 years of neutrality to come and join NATO. But France isn't going to lead NATO or any European Union style solution. We're not doing it because this is a humanitarian act on the part of the United States. We take this position because it's in our national interest to do it. We have national interest everywhere. And if we don't defend them, who do we think will?
Mm-hmm. How is the United States viewed, given that backdrop you've just given on the world stage?
Well, that depends whether some people speak publicly or privately.
Okay.
A lot of people publicly will criticize the United States, but behind closed doors they'll say, thank God you're doing what you're doing. Other people will do the opposite. They'll praise us, but then they'll complain that we're interfering too much in their foreign affairs. So take our friends in Europe as an example. Very frequently they say, my God, the United States is about to draw inward again. They're going through another phase of isolation. They're going to leave us poor Europeans out here to fend for themselves. It's just terrible. You can't do that, they will say. How can the U.S. abandon us? And that lasts for a while until they say the United States is pushing us into conflicts that we don't want to be into. They're interfering in our internal affairs. They're too pushy. They should leave us alone. You know, it depends what time of day you ask them these things. And that's why I think that the U.S. has to make a careful evaluation of its own self-interest. It obviously needs to take into account the views of its friends and allies, but fundamentally, we can't rely on anybody else to do our work for us. And if we're not prepared to do the hard political and diplomatic work to try and accomplish what in NATO we call euphemistically alliance management, then we're not going to be successful.
Mm-hmm. I'm just kind of curious as we talk about public opinion, but politics in particular, about how whether or not those are campaign issues. It's so interesting. The things you just described are significant. They impact all of us, but they're not always the things we talk about when we're trying to pick who our leaders are.
Well, I think it's a very big problem. I mean, if you had somebody who could do a time and motion study of what the President of the United States does on any given day over the entire 4 years of a presidential term and measure what they spent their time on, the amount of time that a president spends on national security issues, meetings with foreign leaders, foreign trips, meetings of the National Security Council, getting intelligence briefings, talking to members of Congress, approving clandestine operations, engaging in military hostilities when necessary. If you added all this together as a percentage of presidential time, and then compared it to the amount of time in recent years that American presidential candidates have spent discussing foreign policy, the disjunction would be enormous. The amount of time spent in political campaigns is like that, and the amount of time a president spends on national security is as big as this room. That is very dangerous for the country, and I blame primarily the political leaders who are not willing to treat the American citizens as adults and explain the nature of the threats we face around the world and what we need to do to protect ourselves.
Mm-hmm. As you think about your hats over time, where does diplomacy now fit in these conversations? It seems, at least from the observation, it's changed, or has it not really at its fundamental level when you're trying to navigate these big issues worldwide?
Well, I think diplomacy changes as circumstances change. You know, when at the time we declared independence and sent envoys off to France, it took 3 months to get from Boston or Philadelphia to Paris, and so Benjamin Franklin arrives in Paris and he sends a note back saying, I've arrived, and it takes 3 months to get back. By the time they read about it in Philadelphia at the Continental Congress, it's 6 months has gone by. So when they say, look, here's a new instruction for you, it takes 3 months to get to Benjamin Franklin, it's always out of date. Today, heads of state talk to each other all the time, and so the entire pace and level of diplomacy has changed. And I think that's we don't really understand that. We still have large embassies that don't engage in diplomacy anymore. They engage in a lot of other things, but it's a different profession than it was 200 or 300 years ago.
Could you synthesize this? We were talking about this. You hear doctrines of approaches here. You got the Monroe Doctrine, the Truman Doctrine, the Bush Doctrine. I'm curious about the Bolton Doctrine. Okay, after all this experience, what is it?
Yeah, well, I'm not big on doctrines. I'm a Burkean conservative. I don't like to make abstractions too often. And particularly in international affairs, people look for bumper stickers to describe what you're, are you an interventionist, or you're a multilateralist, or you're this or that or the other thing. So I try and stay away from that too. But if I had to put it in bumper sticker form, I'd say my policy is pro-American. I'm not trying to design a perfect world. I'm trying to design a world where America is safe.
So this leads into an interesting series of questions where there's been some recent research. Pew has been doing this, where Americans are increasingly pessimistic about the future of our country, our standing in the world. Maybe take a second and talk about maybe why we shouldn't be that way,
Yeah.
if there is a great response to that.
Well, I think the world is a more threatening place, but I don't think that means you need to be pessimistic. I think it means you need to understand the nature of the threat and how to deal with it. And I think in American political discourse domestically, we've had too many people, including a recent former president, who have spent their time telling us it's the end of the world for the United States, that we're in decline. He talked in his inaugural address about American carnage and how the United States is taken advantage of by everyone, friend and foe alike, and how it's how bad things are across the board, domestically, internationally, and so on and so forth. I don't buy that for a minute. I think actually it'll be interesting to see in 2024 if a candidate comes forward who talks about the reasons to be optimistic about America's future. And I think of Ronald Reagan's 1984 re-election campaign, where the theme of many of the ads was, "It's morning in America." And I think personally, I think it's always morning in America. And that is the attitude you have to have, not to be overconfident, but certainly not to give way to despair. We've got enormous advantages in this country. Let's just take one example, China. If you look back 5, 10 years ago, people were saying China's economy is rising at a fantastic rate. It'll overtake the United States by 2020. Well, 2025. Well, someday. And what's happening in China today? As you've probably seen, China's population has peaked and is beginning to decline. India is now probably the most populous nation in the world. So China's population is declining, heading downhill. It is aging. It has a dwindling number of people in the workforce, so fewer workers to support a larger aging population. The effect of the Chinese one-child per family policy has created an enormous problem. When the one-child per family policy was in effect, what happened was girl babies got aborted and boys were born because boys are prized more highly than girls are. So right now you've got a population, depending on your estimate, between 40 to 60 million marriage-age men in China who will never be married because there aren't comparable marriage-age women. And if you don't think that's not a factor for social instability, maybe I could have a word with you after this is over. So they've got enormous problems to face in China, which actually makes them a danger in the near term, but which says again, the country that promotes freedom and rewards ingenuity and creativity, which despite a lot of obstacles we still do, that is the country that will prevail.
We have a lot of students here who are interested in careers in international diplomacy, working in international relations generally. Please, you give some advice to those students who are very interested in this, because clearly these students are going to be part of this discussion for a very long time.
Yeah, well, I think it's a good time to be interested in international affairs. You know, years ago, the only career where you could really guarantee international exposure was in the Foreign Service at the State Department. Some in the military had international experience, but usually not of the kind you really want to sign up and do for 4 or 5 years in the trenches somewhere. But in terms of American business, it was so concentrated. Our market was so much in the United States that the number of international business opportunities was pretty small. That's changed dramatically, obviously. So you've got a lot of possibilities. You could go into the military or the Foreign Service or the Intelligence Service, go back out and go into business or law or finance, come back into government at a later point. I just think the career opportunities in foreign affairs are much more diverse than they ever were before. So it's a great time to be looking.
We probably have time for this one last question here. I'm curious, as we start talking about politics a little bit too, we have sort of a front view right now of the Biden administration's policies in some of these places around the world. You've been an advisor to many Republicans over the years, from Ronald Reagan to both Presidents Bush as well. Talk about the future of the Republican Party when it comes to diplomacy and national security.
Well, I think because of Trump, in large part, the virus of isolationism is back in the party. I think it's still a relatively small problem, but I think that's no reason not to try and deal with it now before it becomes a larger problem. It's something that's come and gone in cycles historically. But I think most Americans still understand that to preserve the way of life we have, the kind of standard of living we have, that if you're not out in the world protecting your interests, then you're defending them in the homeland itself. And there isn't anybody else who's going to do that for us. We can complain about allies that don't bear their fair share of the burden, and a lot of them don't. But are we going to say, well, because they're not doing what they need to do, we're not going to do what we need to do? I think this coming election should be an opportunity to talk about why national security is more important politically than it has been in many recent elections. And I hope that's the direction the debate takes.
What one or two questions we might be looking at in these candidates, whoever emerges on the Republican side, as we talk about the Biden side? Just one or two questions we might think about as voters.
Well, I think the litmus test really about your understanding of international strategy is whether you think it's important to stop the unprovoked Russian aggression against Ukraine. Because it's not just its impact in Ukraine, it's in the broader European, Middle Eastern, Central Asian field, and as I said, it's in Asia as well, because China's looking at it too. So that is a principle that from 1945 forward, America said security and stability in Europe is a bedrock of our foreign policy. This is manifestly a source of enormous instability that threatens NATO members. We can't let it go unanswered. We have said this before in other contexts. When Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990, George H.W. Bush said, "This will not stand, this aggression against Kuwait," and it didn't, and it had a significant impact. And the second, I think, is understanding exactly the threat that China poses. And as I say, we're still expanding our own understanding of it, so there's plenty of room to grow. But to look at China simply as an economic competitor, as too many of our friends in Europe still do, is a big mistake.
Excellent. We're so grateful that you're able to be with us today. Very insightful. Appreciate your service as well and for spending some time answering these questions. Let's give a round of applause for Ambassador John Bolton. Thank you very much. I think we're going to take it right out this way, Ambassador. Thank you. Thank you.
Good luck.
All right, thanks everyone for being here today. I think there's still food out there. Is that right, Nick? Okay, we don't want to be taking any of that home. So please do. Thank you so much for being here today, everyone. Jim?
Hi there, one more announcement. If you're one of our local interns, the sign-in sheet for credit is at the front desk, so make sure to get that on your way out.